Welcome back to another chapter of The Last Years of Merlin. We are approaching the end, I believe. We are on chapter 35, and in the last chapter, Emrys and Shim, who had been shrunk down by Domnu, rode on the back of Trouble and got into the shrouded castle through a window. And that is where we left off. So now they're in the shrouded castle. And we will read chapter 35. Okay. Chapter 35, The Shrouded Castle. When I regained consciousness, the first thing I noticed was how small Trouble had become. The valiant bird sat on top of my chest, poking at me with one wing and then the other. At once I realized the truth. It was I, not the bird, who had changed size. I had grown large again. Seeing me wake up, the Merlin hopped down to the stone floor. He released a slow, quiet whistle, much like a sigh of relief. A similar sound came from the far corner of the bare, shadowy room beneath a sputtering torch fixed to the wall with a black iron stand. Shim sat up, looked at Treble, patted himself from hairy head to hairy toes, blinked, and patted himself again. The little giant turned to me, his nose cradled by a bright smile. "I is gladly to be big and tall again." I raised an eyebrow, but kept myself from smirking. "Yes, we are both big again. Domnu must have worked her magic so that it would wear off if we entered the castle." Shim scowled. "How kindly of her." "I am grateful to her for that much." I reached to stroke the hawk's banded wings. "And more." Trouble gave a resolute chirp. The yellow rims of his eyes shone in the torchlight. He scratched his talons on the stone floor, telling me that once again he was ready for battle. Yet the hawk's feistiness buoyed my spirits for only an instant. I scanned the rough, imposing stones surrounding us. The walls, floor, and ceiling of this room showed no adornment, no craftsmanship whatsoever. The shrouded castle had been built not out of love, but out of fear. If there had been any love at all during its construction, it was merely the love of cold stone and sturdy defenses. As a result, unless this room was an exception, the castle would hold no beauty, no wonder. But it would be in all likelihood to outlast the dark hills themselves. I felt sure it would outlast me. Only then did I notice the continuous rumbling around us. The rumbling swelled, faded, and repeated, as incessantly as ocean waves. The sound of the castle turning on its foundation. As I clambered to my feet, I felt thrown off balance, both by the continuous shaking of the floor and the steady pull toward the outside wall of the room. I stooped to pick up my staff. Even with its support, I needed a moment to stand firmly. I turned to Shim. I would feel a lot better if I still had the Galator. "Look," he replied, standing on his tiptoes by the open window. "It's all so darkly out there, and feels the floor moving and shaking all the time. I doesn't like this place." "Neither do I." "I is scared. Very, very, very scared." "I am too." I nodded in his direction, "but it gives me courage to be with friends." A new gleam appeared in Shim's tiny eyes. "Courage," he said softly to himself. "I gives him courage." "Come." Carefully I crept to the doorway. It led to a dark corridor, lit only by a hissing torch at the far end. We must try to find Rhea. If she is alive, she is probably below in the dungeon. Shim's small chest inflated. "Such a terribly place! I will fight anybody who is hurting her." "No, you won't," I countered. "The castle is guarded by warrior goblins and ghoulians." "Oh," he swiftly deflated. "We should not fight them." "Right. We must outfox them if we can, not fight them." Trouble fluttered up to my shoulder, and we set off. Down the dimly lit corridor we stole, keeping as quiet as possible. Fortunately, the steady rumbling of the revolving castle covered most of our sounds, but for the slightest cracking of my staff against the stones. I reasoned that as long as we could keep ourselves from being discovered, the castle guards were probably not alert for intruders. On the other hand, I vividly recalled expecting the same thing of the goblins patrolling the notch near the haunted marsh. When we reached the hissing torch, crudely jammed into a niche in the stones, the corridor turned sharply to the right. Arched doorways lined both sides of the next section, while only one narrow window slit opened to the outside. As we approached the window, I tensed as I saw shafts of darkness streaming through it, as if shafts of light would pour through a window in any land not choked by the shroud. Gingerly, I placed my hands in the path of one of the shafts. Its coldness nipped at my fingers. My skin felt withered, half alive. With a shiver, I withdrew my hand and moved on. Shim's bare feet padded softly by my side as Trouble's talons hugged my shoulder securely. One corridor led to another, one sputtering torch to the next. All the rooms we encountered were empty except for the writhing shadows of torchlight. I could only imagine how many such empty floors lay within this vast castle, yet for all our wandering we did not discover any stairs. Cautiously, we prowled the maze of corridors, turning left then right, right then left. I began to wonder whether we were traveling in circles, whether we would ever find any stairs to the lower levels. Then, as we approached one doorway, Trouble fluttered against my neck. Suddenly, I heard several raspy voices trading rough remarks. Goblins, several of them from the sound of it. We waited outside the arched door, unsure how to get past them without being seen. Trouble paced agitatedly on my shoulder. Then an idea struck me. I tapped the merlin on the beak while pointing inside the doorway. The hawk seemed to understand instantly. Soundlessly, he floated down to the corridor. Keeping to the shadows by the wall, he slipped into the room. Just outside the doorway, Shim and I traded nervous glances. A few seconds later, one of the goblins yelped in pain. "You stabbed me, you fool!" "I did not," another retorted, over the crash of something metallic. "Liar!" Something heavy thudded against the stone floor. A sword slashed through the air. "I know it's you who's a liar." A brawl began. Swords clanged, fists struck, curses flew. In the commotion, Shim and I sneaked past the doorway. Pausing only long enough for Trouble to swoop back onto his perch on my shoulder, we scuttled down the corridor. As we turned a corner, we found ourselves facing a stairwell. Faintly lit by a flickering torch on the landing, the stone stairs wound downward in near darkness. I led the way, with Trouble riding close to my cheek, both of us trying to sense whatever might lurk in the shadows. Shim, whispering nervously to himself, stayed close behind. The stairs spiraled down to another landing, sinister in the torchlight. Swaying shadows crawled across the walls. As we descended, the rumbling and groaning of the turning foundation increased, as did the stale odor in the air. We followed the stairs down to another level, gloomier than the last, and to another level, still gloomier. Here the stairs ended, opening into a high stone archway. Beyond that lay a dark cellar that reeked of putrid air. "The dungeon," I whispered above the constant rumbling. Shim made no reply except to open his eyes to their widest. From the darkened entrance to the dungeon came a long, painful moan, a moan of sheer agony. The voice sounded almost human, though not quite. As the moan came again, louder than before, Shim froze as stiff as stone. Cautiously, I moved forward without him, poking at the blackest of shadows with my staff. Passing under the archway, I peered into the dungeon. To the left, beneath one of the few torches in the cavernous room, I viewed a man. He lay on his back on a bench of stone. From his slow, regular breathing, he appeared to be asleep. Although a sword and a dagger hung from his belt, he wore no armor except for a narrow red breastplate over his leather shirt and a pointed helmet on his head. Yet the strangest thing about this man was his face. It looked like paper, it was so pale, or like a mask without any expression. Whatever the reason, the face seemed alive and yet not alive. The man suddenly started moaning and wailing. As the sound echoed in the dungeon, I realized that he must be dreaming, recalling in his sleep some moment of pain. Though I felt tempted to wake him, to spare him such torment, I dared not take the risk. As I spun around to tell Shim, I gasped. The little giant was gone. Quickly, I darted back to the stairwell. I called his name, loud enough to be heard over the rumbling of the castle, but not so loud as to wake up the sleeping soldier. Looking frantically, I could see no sign of him. I called again. No answer. How could Shim have vanished? Where could he have gone? Maybe he had, at last, lost his nerve completely. He might be hiding somewhere, quaking. In any case, I had no time to look for him now. With Trouble riding tensely on my shoulder, I turned around and crept past the sleeping soldier under the sizzling torch. Deeper into the dungeon I pushed. Where chains hung from the wall, the stones beneath were darkened with dried blood. I passed cell after cell, some with their heavy doors wide open, some still locked tight. Scanning through the slit in each of the locked doors, I found bones and rotting flesh still on the floor. I could not imagine Rhea, with all her zest for life, imprisoned in such a gruesome place. Yet, given the alternative, I desperately hoped that she was. Since the day the sea returned me to Finkyra, I had discovered a little, but only a little, about my past, and I had learned even less about my true name. Yet those unfinished quests now pulled me on far less strongly than my desire to find Rhea. I was willing to put aside my own unanswered questions, perhaps forever, if only I could somehow reach her in time. I found a cell with a skull crushed beneath a heavy rock, then one in which two skeletons, one the size of an adult and the other no bigger than a baby, embraced each other for eternity. Then one that was completely empty but for the pile of leaves in one corner. More despairing with every step, I trudged on. Had I come all this way to find nothing more than scattered bones and a pile of leaves? I halted. A pile of leaves. I sprinted back to the cell, my heart pounding. I peered again into the narrow slit, just loud enough to be heard over the rumbling. I made the sound that Rhea had shown me to make a beech tree come to life. The pile of leaves stirred. "Rhea?" I whispered excitedly. "Emrys?" She leaped to her feet and bounded to the door. Her garb of vines was tattered and filthy, but she was alive. "Oh, Emrys," she said in disbelief. "Is it you or your ghost?" In answer, I slipped my forefinger through the slit. Tentatively, she wrapped her own around it, as she had so many times before. "It is you. It is. Let me out. First, I must find the key." Rhea's face fell. "The guard, by the entrance. He has the key." She squeezed my finger fearfully. "But he is a soundly sleeper," finished another voice. I whirled around to see Shim gazing up at me, an unmistakable look of pride on his small face. The little giant held out his hand. In it sat a large key, wrought of iron. I stared at him in amazement. "You stole this from the guard?" Shim blushed, his bulbous nose turning almost as pink as his eyes. "He is a soundly sleeper, so it isn't hard." Trouble, seated on my shoulder, whistled in admiration. I grinned. It struck me that Shim might not be so small as he seemed after all. With a rattle of the key, I unlocked the door. Rhea emerged, her face haggard but relieved. She embraced me, Trouble, and finally Shim, whose nose blushed more vividly than before. Turning to me, she asked, "How do we get out of here?" "I haven't figured that part out yet." "Well, then, let's begin." I only wish I still had the Galator. Rhea's jaw dropped. "You lost it?" "I gave it up to get here." Even in the dungeon, her eyes glowed. She hooked her finger around my own again. "You still have us." Together, we started walking toward the entrance. Trouble fluttered against my neck. Even without the Galator against my chest, my heart felt a bit warmer. But only a bit. As we passed the cell with the crushed skull, I told Rhea, "Getting in here was difficult, but getting out will be even more difficult. That is, getting out alive." "I know." She stood as straight as a young beech. "In that case, all we can do is hope that our bossa was right." Trouble, who had started to pace across my shoulder, stopped. He cocked his head as if he were listening. "About meeting again in the other world?" Rhea gave an uncertain nod. "After the long journey." I could only frown. I was sure that, if we died today, there would be no more journeys for us, long or short. Shim tugged on my tunic. "Let's get goings before the snoringly guard wakes." Suddenly, the soldier stepped out of the shadows. His face, deathly pale under his helmet, showed no expression at all. Slowly, he slid his sword out of his scabbard. Then, he lunged at me. Okie dokie. So, my friends, that was chapter 35. Exciting times getting Rhea back. Very happy. But now they have to get out. But we are so close to the end that then we will start the last chapter. Wait, no. We'll start the next book after we finish the last chapter. There we go. Okay, so join me tomorrow for the next chapter. Thank you. Bye.